A little black girl named Layla notices an old man, Mr. Thompson, celebrating his birthday alone at a restaurant. Feeling compassion, she decides to join him, turning what could have been a lonely evening into a heartwarming celebration. What Layla doesn't realize is that her small act of kindness will lead to consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. So, how does Layla's empathy transform the situation, and what surprising turn of events does it lead to? Stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The warm glow of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as Layla and her father, James, walked hand in hand down the familiar street. Their destination was Mama Rosa's, a cozy family restaurant they frequented every Friday evening. The tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering tomato sauce wafted through the air, making Layla's stomach rumble with anticipation. "Daddy, do you think Mama Rosa made her special garlic knots today?" Layla asked, her big brown eyes sparkling with excitement. James chuckled, giving his daughter's hand a gentle squeeze. "I hope so, sweet pea. You know those are my favorite too." As they approached the restaurant, the cheerful chatter of families and friends enjoying their meals spilled out onto the sidewalk. The rustic wooden sign above the door creaked gently in the breeze, welcoming them inside. "Good evening, James." "Hello there, little Miss Layla." Mama Rosa herself greeted them warmly as they entered. Her round face was flushed from the heat of the kitchen, and her apron was dusted with flour. "Your usual table is waiting for you." Layla beamed at the motherly woman. "Hi, Mama Rosa. Did you make garlic knots today?" "Of course I did. I know my two favorite customers can't resist them." Mama Rosa winked, leading them to their cozy corner booth. The restaurant buzzed with life. Families laughed over steaming plates of pasta. Couples shared intimate conversations over candlelit tables, and the clinking of cutlery created a comforting symphony. Layla slid into her seat, her legs swinging happily as she surveyed the familiar surroundings. James settled in across from her, his face softening as he gazed at his daughter. "So, how was school today, Layla? Did you learn anything exciting?" Layla's face lit up. "Oh yes, we learned about butterflies, Daddy. Did you know they start as caterpillars and then go into a cocoon before they become beautiful butterflies? It's like magic." As James listened intently to Layla's animated recounting of her day, a movement at the far end of the restaurant caught his eye. An elderly man had just been seated at a small table near the window. He was dressed in a neat but slightly worn tweed jacket, his white hair neatly combed. What struck James was the man's expression, a mixture of weariness and resignation that seemed out of place in the cheerful atmosphere of Mama Rosa's. Layla, noticing her father's distraction, followed his gaze. "Daddy, why does that man look so sad?" James turned back to his daughter, impressed by her perceptiveness. "I'm not sure, sweetie. Sometimes people feel lonely, especially when they're older." As they continued their conversation, Mama Rosa approached the old man's table. "Mr. Thompson, it's so good to see you again. Happy birthday." Layla's ears perked up at the word birthday. She watched as Mama Rosa placed a small cupcake with a single candle in front of Mr. Thompson. The old man's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Daddy," Layla whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Why is Mr. Thompson alone on his birthday? Doesn't he have any family or friends to celebrate with?" James sighed softly, choosing his words carefully. "Well, Layla, sometimes as people get older, they might lose touch with friends or family. Or maybe they don't have any family left. It can be a lonely time for some people." Layla's brow furrowed as she processed this information. She watched as Mr. Thompson blew out his candle with a small puff, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of his solitude had suddenly become too heavy to bear. "But Daddy, nobody should be alone on their birthday," Layla said, her voice filled with determination. "Can we go say hello to him? Maybe we could sing him a birthday song." James hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude on the man's privacy. But as he looked at his daughter's earnest face, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at her compassion. "That's very kind of you to think of him, Layla. Why don't we ask Mama Rosa if it's okay first?" Layla nodded eagerly, and James waved Mama Rosa over to their table. After a brief explanation, Mama Rosa's eyes misted over with emotion. "Oh, bless your hearts. Mr. Thompson is a sweet old soul who's been coming here for years. I'm sure he'd appreciate the company." With Mama Rosa's blessing, Layla slid out of the booth, smoothing down her favorite yellow dress. James followed close behind as they approached Mr. Thompson's table. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson?" James said softly. The old man looked up, surprise evident in his faded blue eyes. "I hope we're not interrupting, but my daughter Layla here heard it was your birthday, and she wanted to wish you well." Mr. Thompson's weathered face crinkled into a genuine smile as he looked at Layla. "Well, hello there, young lady. That's very kind of you." Layla, suddenly feeling a bit shy, stepped forward. "Happy birthday, Mr. Thompson. I hope you don't mind, but I thought maybe you'd like some company to celebrate." The old man's eyes widened, clearly touched by the gesture. I would like that very much, actually. Thank you." James pulled up a chair for Layla, and she climbed onto it, her feet dangling above the floor. "How old are you today, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her natural curiosity taking over. Mr. Thompson chuckled, the sound a bit rusty, as if he hadn't laughed in a while. "I'm 75 today, believe it or not." Layla's eyes grew wide. "Wow, that's a lot of birthdays. What kind of cake do you like best?" As Mr. Thompson began to answer, James watched in amazement as the old man's demeanor transformed. The weariness seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by a spark of life that hadn't been there before. "Well, when I was a boy, my mother used to make the most delicious chocolate cake with vanilla frosting," Mr. Thompson recalled, a faraway look in his eyes. "I haven't had a cake like that in years." "Chocolate cake is my favorite too," Layla exclaimed. "Daddy makes me one every year for my birthday." "Right, Daddy?" James nodded, smiling at the unlikely pair. "That's right, Sweet Pea. Maybe next year we can make an extra one for Mr. Thompson." The conversation flowed easily, with Layla's innocent questions drawing out stories from Mr. Thompson's long life. He told her about growing up in a small town, his adventures as a young man, and his career as a teacher. With each memory shared, it seemed as if years were melting away from Mr. Thompson's face. As they talked, Mama Rosa approached the table with a knowing smile. In her hands, she carried a small chocolate cake adorned with a single candle. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Thompson, but I overheard your conversation. We always keep a chocolate cake on hand, just in case." Mr. Thompson's eyes misted over as Mama Rosa set the cake in front of him. "Oh my, I don't know what to say." "Make a wish, Mr. Thompson," Layla encouraged, clapping her hands excitedly. The old man closed his eyes for a moment, then blew out the candle with a surprising gust of breath. The small group erupted in applause, and several nearby diners joined in, creating a ripple of joy throughout the restaurant. As Mama Rosa cut slices of cake for everyone, Mr. Thompson turned to Layla with a twinkle in his eye. "You know, young lady, this is the best birthday I've had in a very long time. Thank you for your kindness." Layla beamed, chocolate frosting smeared on her chin. "You're welcome, Mr. Thompson. Nobody should be alone on their birthday." James watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. He marveled at how his daughter's simple act of kindness had transformed what could have been a lonely evening into a celebration of life and connection. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Thompson shook James's hand warmly. "You have a remarkable daughter, sir. Her compassion is a rare gift." James nodded, placing a hand on Layla's shoulder. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, and happy birthday again." As they left the restaurant, Layla's small hand tucked safely in his. James couldn't help but feel that they had all received a gift that evening, a reminder of the power of human connection and the impact a simple act of kindness could have. Little did they know that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would change their lives forever. But for now, as they walked home under the twinkling stars, all was right in their world, warmed by the glow of a birthday celebration and a new friendship forged in the cozy confines of Mama Rosa's restaurant. The morning sun peeked through the curtains of the cozy apartment, casting a warm glow across the living room where Layla sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by her favorite coloring books and crayons. James bustled about in the kitchen, the aroma of pancakes and coffee filling the air. It was a typical Saturday morning for the father-daughter duo, a time they both cherished for its simplicity and togetherness. "Daddy, can we go to the park later?" Layla called out, her crayon moving in broad strokes across the paper. "I want to see if the ducklings have hatched yet." James chuckled, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "Sure thing, sweet pea. We can pack a picnic and make a day of it." "How does that sound?" Layla's face lit up with excitement. "Oh yes, please. Can we bring extra bread for the ducks?" "Of course," James replied, sliding the last pancake onto a plate. "Now come on over and eat your breakfast before it gets cold." As Layla scrambled to her feet, a sharp knock on the door echoed through the apartment. James furrowed his brow, not expecting any visitors this early on a Saturday. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and made his way to the door. "Coming," he called out, unlocking the deadbolt. As the door swung open, James found himself face to face with two police officers. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, while the other was a shorter woman with kind eyes that seemed at odds with her crisp uniform. "Good morning, sir." The male officer spoke first, his voice deep and authoritative. "I'm Officer Johnson, and this is my partner, Officer Chen. Are you James Wilson?" James nodded, a knot of worry forming in his stomach. "Yes, that's me. Is everything all right?" Officer Chen stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Wilson, we're here to speak with your daughter, Layla. Is she home?" The knot in James's stomach tightened. His protective instincts kicked in immediately. "May I ask what this is about?" "Layla's only 8 years old." "We understand your concern, Mr. Wilson," Officer Johnson replied. "We're investigating a situation related to an elderly gentleman your daughter interacted with last night at a local restaurant. We just need to ask her a few questions." James's mind raced back to their dinner at Mama Rose's, to the kind old man they had met. What could have possibly happened to warrant a police investigation? "Daddy? Who's at the door?" Layla's small voice piped up from behind him. She peeked around his leg, her eyes widening at the sight of the uniformed officers. James placed a protective hand on Layla's shoulder. "Sweetie, these police officers would like to talk to you about Mr. Thompson, the gentleman we met at dinner last night. Is that okay?" Layla nodded solemnly, her earlier excitement replaced by a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Why don't we all sit down in the living room?" James suggested, ushering the officers inside. He guided Layla to the couch, sitting close beside her as the officers took seats in the adjacent armchairs. Officer Chen leaned forward, her voice soft and reassuring. "Layla, we heard that you did a very kind thing last night by keeping Mr. Thompson company on his birthday. Can you tell us about that?" Layla glanced at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the previous evening. "Well, we were at Mama Rose's for dinner, like we always are on Fridays. I saw Mr. Thompson sitting all alone, and Mama Rosa brought him a cupcake because it was his birthday. He looked so sad, and I asked Daddy if we could go say hello." As Layla spoke, Officer Johnson jotted down notes in a small notepad. James watched carefully, his arm protectively draped around his daughter's shoulders. "That was very thoughtful of you, Layla," Officer Chen smiled. "Can you tell us more about your conversation with Mr. Thompson? Did he say anything that seemed strange or upset him?" Layla's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "Not really. He told me stories about when he was young and about being a teacher. Oh, and he really liked the chocolate cake Mama Rosa brought. He said it was just like his mom used to make." Officer Johnson looked up from his notepad. "Did Mr. Thompson mention any family or friends? Anyone he was planning to see after dinner?" Layla shook her head. "No, he didn't talk about any family. He just said he hadn't had a birthday like that in a long time." As the questioning continued, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, he couldn't contain his concern any longer. "Officers, I appreciate your thoroughness, but can you please tell us what's going on? Has something happened to Mr. Thompson?" The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Chen spoke. "Mr. Wilson, I'm afraid Mr. Thompson was found unresponsive in his home late last night. The paramedics were unable to revive him." A heavy silence fell over the room. James felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Beside him, Layla's eyes welled up with tears. You mean Mr. Thompson died? Layla's voice was barely above a whisper. Officer Chin nodded solemnly. Yes, sweetheart. I'm very sorry. Layla turned to bury her face in her father's side, her small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. James held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. I don't understand, James said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He seemed fine last night. A bit lonely, perhaps, but certainly not ill. Officer Johnson cleared his throat. That's part of what we're trying to determine, Mr. Wilson. Given that you and your daughter were likely the last people to interact with Mr. Thompson, we needed to gather as much information as possible. As Layla's sobs subsided, she looked up at the officers with red-rimmed eyes. Did we do something wrong? Did we make him sick? Oh no, sweetheart, Officer Chin quickly reassured her. You did nothing wrong. In fact, from what you've told us, you gave Mr. Thompson a wonderful last evening. You should be very proud of your kindness. James hugged Layla tighter, feeling a mix of pride in his daughter's compassion and a deep sadness for Mr. Thompson's lonely life and death. Is there anything else you need from us? James asked, eager to comfort his daughter in private. Officer Johnson stood, tucking away his notepad. No, Mr. Wilson. You've both been very helpful. We'll be in touch if we need any further information. As James walked the officers to the door, Officer Chin turned back. Mr. Wilson, I know this must be difficult, but please remember that your daughter's kindness made a real difference in Mr. Thompson's final hours. That's something to hold on to. With a final nod, the officers left, leaving James and Layla to process the shocking news. James returned to the couch, gathering Layla into his arms. Daddy, Layla sniffled. Why did Mr. Thompson have to die? He was so nice. James stroked her hair gently. Sometimes, sweetie, it's just a person's time to go. But you know what? Because of you, Mr. Thompson's last birthday was a happy one. You made his last night special. As they sat together, the pancakes growing cold in the kitchen, James marveled at how quickly life could change. Just yesterday, they were celebrating a stranger's birthday. Now they were mourning his loss. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. James called his sister, Angela, to fill her in on the situation. She offered to come over and help with Layla, but James politely declined, feeling that he and Layla needed time to process together. By early afternoon, news of the police visit had spread through their tight-knit neighborhood like wildfire. The constant pinging of James's phone with text messages and social media notifications became a steady backdrop to their quiet day at home. As James prepared a light lunch, a knock on the door signaled the arrival of their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez. Her round face was creased with concern as James invited her in. "Oh, James," she said, her accented English filled with emotion. "I just heard about what happened. How are you and little Layla holding up?" James managed a weak smile. "We're doing okay, Mrs. Gonzalez. It's been a shock, but we're managing." Mrs. Gonzalez nodded sympathetically. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it. Some people are worried, you know how they get. But most of us, we think what Layla did was beautiful. Such a kind heart, that child." As if on cue, Layla emerged from her room, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched tightly to her chest. Mrs. Gonzalez immediately enveloped her in a warm hug. "There's my brave girl," she cooed. "You know, Layla, what you did for that poor man was a true mitzvah, a blessing." Layla looked up, her eyes still puffy from crying. "Really? But he still died, Mrs. Gonzalez." The older woman cupped Layla's face in her hands. "Yes, mi cielo, but he died knowing that there was still kindness in the world. That's a precious gift you gave him." As Mrs. Gonzalez chatted with Layla, James's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Tom, another neighbor who lived down the hall. "Hey, James, heard about what happened. Some folks are getting together in the community room to talk about it. You should come if you're up for it." James hesitated, torn between wanting to stay with Layla and needing to understand how this event was affecting their community. Mrs. Gonzalez, noticing his distraction, offered a solution. "Why don't I stay here with Layla for a bit? We can bake some cookies. It might help take her mind off things." Grateful for the offer, James knelt down next to Layla. "Sweet pea, would it be okay if I went to talk to some of the neighbors for a little while? Mrs. Gonzalez will stay here with you." Layla nodded, a small smile forming at the prospect of baking. "Okay, Daddy. Can we make chocolate chip cookies?" "Of course you can," James said, kissing her forehead. "I won't be gone long." As James made his way to the community room, he could hear the low murmur of voices even before he opened the door. Inside, a group of about 15 neighbors had gathered, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Tom, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, waved James over. "Glad you could make it, James. We were just talking about what happened." As James settled into a chair, he became aware of the various conversations happening around him. Some neighbors were expressing worry about the safety of the neighborhood, while others were praising Layla's actions. "I just don't understand," Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman from the 5th floor, was saying. "How could the police think a little girl had anything to do with that poor man's death?" "They don't," James interjected, feeling the need to clarify. "They were just gathering information because we were probably the last people to see Mr. Thompson alive." A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to James. He took a deep breath and recounted the events of the previous evening and the morning's police visit. As he spoke, James could see the tension in the room gradually dissipate. Looks of suspicion were replaced by expressions of sympathy and admiration. "You're Layla. She's got a heart of gold," Mr. Ramirez, the building superintendent, said with a nod. "Not many kids these days would think to keep an old man company like that." Others murmured in agreement, and James felt a swell of pride mixed with his lingering sadness and confusion. "But what happens now?" asked Sarah, a young mother who lived on James's floor. "I mean, does this change anything for our community?" Tom leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it should. Maybe this is a wake-up call for all of us to look out for our elderly neighbors a bit more. Who knows how long Mr. Thompson had been lonely before Layla reached out to him?" The conversation continued, with neighbors sharing ideas about how to create a more connected community. James listened, feeling a strange mix of emotions: grief for Mr. Thompson, pride in Layla, and a growing sense of belonging in this community that cared so deeply. As the impromptu meeting wound down, James stood to leave, feeling both emotionally drained and oddly uplifted. Several neighbors approached him, offering words of support and praise for Layla. "You've raised a wonderful daughter, James," Mrs. Peterson said, patting his arm. "She's a credit to you and to our whole community." Thanking everyone for their kind words, James made his way back to his apartment. As he approached his door, the sweet smell of freshly baked cookies wafted into the hallway. Inside, he found Layla and Mrs. Gonzalez at the kitchen table, decorating the cookies with colorful icing. "Daddy!" Layla exclaimed, her earlier sadness momentarily forgotten in the joy of creation. "Look at the cookies we made. This one's for you." She held up a slightly misshapen cookie decorated with what appeared to be a smiley face. James felt his heart swell with love for his resilient little girl. "It's beautiful, sweet pea," he said, accepting the cookie with a smile. "Thank you." As he bit into the sweet treat, James caught Mrs. Gonzalez's eye. She gave him a knowing look, silently communicating that Layla had been okay in his absence. "How was the meeting?" Mrs. Gonzalez asked as she began cleaning up the baking mess. James sank into a chair, suddenly feeling the weight of the day. "It was good, actually. Everyone's been very supportive. They all think Layla did a wonderful thing." Layla looked up from her cookie decorating, her expression serious. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Thompson is happy now? In heaven?" James reached out to stroke his daughter's hair, marveling at her ability to ask such profound questions. "I'm sure he is, sweetie. And I bet he's looking down right now, thinking about the wonderful birthday you gave him." As the afternoon faded into evening, James found himself reflecting on the whirlwind of events. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into a community-wide moment of reflection. He thought about Mr. Thompson, a man they had known for such a short time, yet who had left such an impact. Later that night, as he tucked Layla into bed, she asked in a small voice, "Daddy, can we do something to remember Mr. Thompson?" James smiled, an idea forming in his mind. "That's a wonderful thought, Layla. How about tomorrow we go to the park and plant a flower in his memory? We can watch it grow and remember the difference a little kindness can make." Layla nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. "I like that, Daddy. And maybe we can bring cookies for the ducks, too. As James kissed his daughter goodnight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to spread the kindness that Layla had so naturally shown. In the face of loss and confusion, their community had come together, reminding James that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to be found. The days following Mr. Thompson's passing were a blur of emotions for James and Layla. The initial shock had given way to a quiet sadness, punctuated by moments of reflection on the brief but meaningful connection they had made with the elderly man. Life continued its steady rhythm, but there was an undercurrent of change in the air, as if the community was holding its collective breath, waiting for something to happen. It was a crisp Wednesday afternoon when that something finally came. James had just picked Layla up from school, and they were walking home, hand in hand, discussing her day. And then in art class, we made memory boxes, Layla was saying, her backpack bouncing with each step. I decorated mine with flowers and butterflies. I think I'll put the cookie recipe Mrs. Gonzalez gave us in it, to remember the day we baked together. James smiled, touched by his daughter's thoughtfulness. That's a lovely idea, Sweet Pea. It's important to keep memories of the good times, even when they come from sad moments. As they approached their apartment building, James noticed two familiar figures standing near the entrance. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized Officers Johnson and Chun, the same police officers who had visited them days earlier. Layla, too, had spotted them, and her grip on James's hand tightened slightly. "Daddy, why are the police here again?" she whispered, a hint of worry in her voice. James squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'm not sure, honey, but don't worry. I'm sure everything's okay. Let's go see what they want." As they drew closer, Officer Chin spotted them and waved, a warm smile on her face. This simple gesture helped ease some of the tension James felt building in his chest. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson, Layla," Officer Chin greeted them. "We hope we're not interrupting anything, but we have some information we'd like to share with you both. Is now a good time to talk?" James nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Of course. Would you like to come up to our apartment?" "That would be perfect, thank you," Officer Johnson replied. The group made their way up to the Wilsons' apartment in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Once inside, James invited the officers to sit at the kitchen table while he and Layla took seats across from them. "Can I get you anything to drink?" James offered, ever the gracious host despite his nervousness. Both officers politely declined, and Officer Chin leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "Mr. Wilson, Layla, we've learned some new information about Mr. Thompson that we thought you should know." Layla's eyes widened, and she scooted closer to her father. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, bracing himself for whatever news was to come. Officer Johnson cleared his throat before continuing. "It turns out that Mr. Thompson was quite a remarkable man. He was a well-known philanthropist who had donated millions of dollars to various charities over the years, particularly those focusing on children's education and welfare." James felt his jaw drop in surprise. The kind but lonely old man they had met at the restaurant had been a millionaire philanthropist? It seemed almost unbelievable. But if he was so rich and famous, why was he all alone? Layla asked, voicing the question that was on James's mind as well. Officer Chin's expression softened. "That's a very good question, Layla. You see, Mr. Thompson had a family once, a wife, a daughter, and a granddaughter. But about 10 years ago, they were all involved in a terrible car accident. Mr. Thompson was the only survivor." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of this revelation sank in. James felt a lump form in his throat as he imagined the pain Mr. Thompson must have endured. After the accident, Officer Johnson continued, Mr. Thompson withdrew from public life. He moved to this neighborhood to live quietly, away from the spotlight. He continued his charitable work, but did so anonymously. It seems he was struggling with deep loneliness and depression in recent years. Layla's lip quivered slightly. "That's so sad. No wonder he looked so lonely at the restaurant." Officer Chin nodded, then leaned in, her voice gentle. "But that's where you come in, Layla. We spoke with Mr. Thompson's housekeeper, who saw in the morning after your dinner together. She said she hadn't seen him so happy in years. He couldn't stop talking about the sweet little girl who had made his birthday special. Layla's eyes widened in surprise. Really? I made him that happy. You did, Officer Johnson confirmed with a smile. In fact, the housekeeper told us that Mr. Thompson said you reminded him of his granddaughter. Your kindness brought back happy memories for him. James felt a swell of pride mixed with a tinge of sadness. So, what exactly happened to Mr. Thompson that night? The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Chin spoke. According to the medical examiner, Mr. Thompson passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no pain, no struggle. He simply didn't wake up. The housekeeper found him the next morning, Officer Johnson added. She said he had a smile on his face, and there was a framed photo of his family on the nightstand, something she'd never seen before. It seems your kindness, Layla, gave Mr. Thompson a sense of peace in his final hours. Tears welled up in Layla's eyes, but they weren't entirely sad tears. There was a glimmer of something else, perhaps understanding or even a sense of completion. James pulled her close, feeling his own eyes growing misty. We wanted to thank you both, Officer Chin said, her voice filled with sincerity. Your simple act of kindness made a world of difference to a man who had known great sorrow. It's a reminder to all of us about the power of compassion. As the officers prepared to leave, Layla suddenly spoke up. Wait, I have something for you. She darted to her room and returned moments later with 2 cookies from the batch she and Mrs. Gonzalez had baked. These are for you, to say thank you for helping Mr. Thompson. The officers accepted the cookies with touched smiles, thanking Layla for her thoughtfulness. As James showed them out, Officer Johnson turned to him. You've raised an extraordinary daughter, Mr. Wilson. The world could use more people like Layla. After the officers left, James and Layla sat together on the couch, processing the information they'd just received. Layla curled up against her father's side, her voice small but steady. Daddy, do you think Mr. Thompson is with his family now? James stroked her hair gently. I'd like to think so, sweet pea. And I bet he's telling them all about the wonderful little girl who made his last birthday so special. The next morning, as James was preparing breakfast, the phone rang. The caller introduced himself as Mr. Goldstein, a lawyer representing Mr. Thompson's estate. James listened in stunned silence as Mr. Goldstein explained the purpose of his call. Mr. Wilson, I understand this may come as a surprise, but Mr. Thompson left specific instructions in the event of his passing. He wanted to express his gratitude to your daughter, Layla, for her kindness on his final birthday. Would it be possible for us to meet later today? There are some matters we need to discuss in person. James agreed, his mind reeling from this unexpected turn of events. When he told Layla about the call, her reaction was a mix of confusion and curiosity. But Daddy, I didn't do anything special. I just wanted Mr. Thompson to be happy on his birthday, she said, her brow furrowed. James knelt down to her level, looking into her eyes. Sweetie, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact. You saw someone who was lonely, and you reached out to them. That's pretty special in my book. Later that afternoon, James and Layla found themselves in a plush office in the city center. Mr. Goldstein, a kindly older gentleman with wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them warmly. Ah, you must be the famous Layla, he said, bending down to shake her hand. Mr. Thompson spoke very highly of you in our last conversation. As they settled into comfortable chairs, Mr. Goldstein pulled out a crisp, white envelope from a folder. Layla, Mr. Thompson left this letter for you. Would you like me to read it aloud? Layla nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. Mr. Goldstein cleared his throat and began to read. Dear Layla, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. But please don't be sad. Thanks to you, my final birthday was filled with more joy than I've known in years. You see, I lost my family a long time ago, and since then, I've been very lonely. But your kindness reminded me of the love and happiness I once knew. You reminded me of my granddaughter, Emily, who would be about your age now. I want you to know that your simple act of sitting with me and talking made a big difference. It showed me that there is still goodness and compassion in the world. I have asked my lawyer, Mr. Goldstein, to set up a small trust fund for you. It's not much, but I hope it will help you pursue your dreams and continue spreading kindness wherever you go. Always remember, Layla, that a little bit of kindness can change someone's whole world. Never stop being the wonderful, caring person you are. Thank you for making an old man's last birthday a happy one. Your friend, Mr. Thompson. As Mr. Goldstein finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Layla sat in stunned silence, tears rolling down her cheeks. James wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes misty. Mr. Goldstein gave them a moment to compose themselves before continuing. Mr. Thompson has indeed set up a trust fund for Layla. It will cover her college education and provide a small stipend for her to use for charitable causes if she wishes. James was overwhelmed by the generosity. Mr. Goldstein, this is too much. We can't possibly. But Mr. Goldstein held up a hand to stop him. Mr. Wilson, I knew Arthur Thompson for many years. He was a man who understood the value of kindness and education. Please, allow his final wish to be fulfilled. This is his way of ensuring that Layla's compassion continues to make a difference in the world. As they left the lawyer's office, Layla was uncharacteristically quiet. James knelt down beside her on the sidewalk. What's on your mind, sweet pea? Layla looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. Daddy, I want to use the money Mr. Thompson gave me to help other people. Can we do that? James felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter. Of course we can, Layla. We'll figure out the best way to honor Mr. Thompson's memory together. In the days that followed, news of Mr. Thompson's story and Layla's act of kindness spread through the community like wildfire. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing James and Layla about their experience. The impact was immediate and profound. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other for years suddenly found themselves striking up conversations in the hallways and elevators. The community room, once rarely used, became a hub of activity as residents organized potluck dinners and game nights. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman from the 5th floor, started a friendly visitor program, pairing up younger residents with older ones for weekly chats and outings. Mr. Ramirez, the superintendent, began offering free basic computer classes to help older residents stay connected with family and friends online. Layla, for her part, became something of a local celebrity. But what touched people wasn't the size of her gesture, but its simplicity. She hadn't done anything grand or heroic. She had simply been kind to someone who needed it. It was something anyone could do, and that realization sparked a wave of similar acts throughout the community. One Saturday morning, about a month after Mr. Thompson's passing, James and Layla were walking through the neighborhood park when they noticed a crowd gathered near the central fountain. As they approached, they saw a small podium set up with the mayor standing behind it. "Ah, there she is," the mayor exclaimed, spotting Layla. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Layla Wilson, the young lady who has taught our city a valuable lesson in compassion." Bewildered, James and Layla made their way to the front of the crowd. The mayor smiled down at Layla. "Young lady, your kindness to Mr. Thompson has inspired our entire community. In honor of that, we've decided to dedicate this fountain to the spirit of compassion you've awakened in us all." He pulled a cord, unveiling a small plaque on the fountain. It read, "The Thompson-Wilson Fountain of Kindness. May we always remember that a single act of compassion can ripple out to change the world." Layla stared at the plaque in awe, then looked up at her father. "Daddy, did I really do all this?" James knelt down beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "You started at Sweet Pea. You showed everyone how easy and important it is to be kind. You should be very proud." As the crowd applauded, James saw familiar faces all around. Mrs. Gonzalez wiping away a tear, Mr. Ramirez beaming with pride, Officer Chen giving a thumbs up from the back. In that moment, he realized that their community had been forever changed by one simple act of kindness. Later that evening, as James tucked Layla into bed, she asked a question that made his heart swell. "Daddy, can we go to Mama Rosa's tomorrow? I want to sit at Mr. Thompson's table and remember him." James smiled, kissing her forehead. "That's a wonderful idea, Sweet Pea. And maybe we can invite Mrs. Peterson to join us. I think she'd like that." As Layla drifted off to sleep, James stood by her bedroom window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about Mr. Thompson, about the power of kindness, and about the incredible daughter he was blessed with. In a world that often seemed dark and divided, Layla had shown that a single spark of compassion could light the way for an entire community. And as he turned off the light and closed Layla's door, James made a silent promise to nurture that spark, to keep it burning bright, and to always remember the lesson that Mr. Thompson and Layla had taught them all. That in the end, it's not about grand gestures or heroic deeds, but about the simple, everyday kindnesses that truly change the world. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of Mr. Thompson's generous gift began to unfold in ways that James and Layla could never have imagined. The trust fund, carefully managed by Mr. Goldstein, provided a sense of financial security that James had never known before. It was a strange feeling, realizing that the constant worry about making ends meet had suddenly evaporated. One sunny morning, as James prepared breakfast, he found himself staring at the calendar on the fridge. The date circled in red caught his eye. It was his work anniversary, a day that usually passed without much fanfare. But this year felt different. "Layla," he called out, a hint of excitement in his voice. "Can you come here for a minute, sweetie?" Layla bounded into the kitchen, her curls bouncing with each step. "What is it, Daddy?" James knelt down to her level, a smile playing on his lips. "How would you feel if I took some time off work? Maybe we could spend more time together, do some of those things we've always talked about but never had the chance to do." Layla's eyes widened with joy. "Really? You mean like going to the zoo on a weekday? Or having picnics in the park?" James chuckled, pulling her into a hug. "Exactly like that. And maybe we could even start working on some of those community projects you've been talking about." Later that day, James sat in his boss's office, explaining his decision to take a sabbatical. Mr. Johnson, a kind-faced man in his 50s, listened intently. "I have to say, James, I'm surprised," Mr. Johnson said, leaning back in his chair. "But after everything you've been through, I understand. How long are you thinking?" James took a deep breath. 6 months, maybe a year. I want to spend more time with Layla, help her with some community projects she's passionate about. Mr. Thompson's gift has given us this opportunity, and I don't want to waste it." Mr. Johnson nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Well, James, you've been an asset to this company for years. Take the time you need. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." As James left the office building, a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying seemed to lift from his shoulders. The city bustled around him, but for the first time in years, he felt no urgency to rush home and start preparing for the next workday. Instead, he found himself walking to Layla's school, eager to surprise her with the news. When the final bell rang, Layla emerged from the building, her face lighting up at the sight of her father. "Daddy, what are you doing here?" James scooped her up in a hug. "I thought we could walk home together today, and I have some exciting news to share." As they strolled through the neighborhood, James explained his decision to take time off work. Layla listened intently, her mind already whirring with possibilities. "Daddy," she said, her voice serious, "I've been thinking about Mr. Thompson and how he helped people. Do you think we could do something like that?" James smiled down at her. "What did you have in mind, sweet pea?" Layla's words tumbled out in a rush of excitement. "Well, remember how Mr. Thompson liked to help kids? Maybe we could start a program at my school to help kids who don't have enough food or school supplies. And we could visit lonely old people like Mr. Thompson, so they don't feel sad." James felt a swell of pride at his daughter's compassion. "Those are wonderful ideas, Layla. Why don't we sit down tonight and make a plan? We can figure out how to use some of Mr. Thompson's gift to make these projects happen." Over the next few months, James and Layla threw themselves into their community projects with enthusiasm. They worked with Layla's school to start a weekend backpack program, sending food home with kids who might otherwise go hungry. They organized a school supply drive, ensuring that every child in Layla's class had the tools they needed to succeed. But it was their friendly visitors program that truly took off. Inspired by Mrs. Peterson's earlier efforts, Layla and James worked with local senior centers to match volunteers with elderly residents who needed companionship. Layla herself became a regular visitor to several seniors, brightening their days with her infectious smile and genuine interest in their stories. One crisp autumn afternoon, As James and Layla walked home from visiting Mrs. Henderson, one of their regular friendly visitors participants, Layla grew quiet and thoughtful. "What's on your mind, sweet pea?" James asked, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Layla looked up at him, her eyes wise beyond her years. "Daddy, I've been thinking about Mr. Thompson and all the people we've met. It's funny, isn't it? How just being kind to someone can change so much." James nodded, encouraging her to continue. "It's like, when I sat with Mr. Thompson that night, I didn't know I was doing anything special. I just wanted him to be happy on his birthday. But look at everything that happened because of that one little thing." James felt a lump form in his throat. "You're right, Layla. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact. Mr. Thompson taught us that." Layla nodded solemnly. "And now, when we visit Mrs. Henderson or help at the school, it's like we're passing on Mr. Thompson's kindness. It keeps growing and growing." As they walked, James marveled at his daughter's insight. She had grasped a truth that many adults struggled to understand, that empathy and compassion were not finite resources, but rather multiplied when shared. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from behind them. "Layla, Mr. Wilson." They turned to see Officer Chen jogging towards them, a warm smile on her face. "Hello, Officer Chen," Layla greeted her cheerfully. "We just came from visiting Mrs. Henderson. She told me all about when she was a nurse during the war." Officer Chen's eyes crinkled with amusement. "That sounds fascinating, Layla. You know, I've been hearing a lot about your Friendly Visitors program. The station's been getting calls from people wanting to know how they can get involved." James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Really? I had no idea it had gotten so much attention." Officer Chen nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, yes. In fact, the chief was wondering if you two might be willing to come speak at our community outreach event next month. Share your story, inspire others to get involved. What do you think?" Layla looked up at James, her eyes shining with excitement. James felt a mix of pride and humility wash over him. "We'd be honored, Officer Chen. Right, Layla?" Layla nodded vigorously. "Can I tell them about Mr. Thompson?" "Of course, sweetie," Officer Chen replied. "That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear." As Officer Chen said goodbye and continued on her patrol, James and Layla resumed their walk home, both lost in thought about the unexpected turns their life had taken. That evening, as James tucked Layla into bed, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Thompson would be proud of us?" James sat on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair gently. "I think he'd be very proud, sweet pea. But more than that, I think he'd be happy. Happy to know that his kindness is still making a difference in the world through you." Layla smiled sleepily. "I'm glad. I want to keep making him happy, even though he's not here anymore." As James turned out the light and closed Layla's door, he found himself reflecting on the past few months. The financial stability provided by Mr. Thompson's gift had allowed him to step back from work, but it was the emotional richness of this time with Layla that truly felt like the greater gift. The next morning, over breakfast, Layla brought up an idea that had clearly been percolating in her mind. "Daddy, I was thinking, Mr. Thompson did so much for us. Is there a way we could do something special to remember him?" James sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind, sweetie?" Layla's eyes lit up. "Well, remember how you said Mr. Thompson loved the old oak tree in the park? The one where he used to read to his granddaughter? What if we planted a new tree near it so it could grow big and strong like that one?" James felt a warmth spread through his chest at his daughter's thoughtfulness. "Layla, that's a beautiful idea. Why don't we talk to the Parks Department and see if we can make it happen?" A few phone calls and a meeting with the city's parks director later, and the plan was set in motion. On a crisp Saturday morning, James and Layla found themselves standing in the park, surrounded by a small crowd of friends and community members. Mr. Goldstein was there, along with Officers Chun and Johnson, Mrs. Gonzalez, and several of the seniors from their Friendly Visitors program. As the Parks Department worker carefully lowered the young oak sapling into the prepared hole, Layla stepped forward, a small envelope clutched in her hands. "Before we finish planting the tree," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her nervousness, "I'd like to read something." The crowd quieted as Layla unfolded a piece of paper from the envelope. "Dear Mr. Thompson," she began, "we're planting this tree for you today. Daddy says trees are like people. They start small, but with love and care, they grow big and strong. Your kindness was like a seed, Mr. Thompson. It started small when you shared your birthday with me, but it's grown into something big, touching so many people's lives. I promise to take care of this tree and watch it grow, and I promise to keep spreading kindness, just like you did. Thank you for teaching me that even small acts of kindness can change the world. Love, Layla. As Layla finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. James stepped forward and helped Layla place the letter in the hole beside the sapling before they both began to fill in the earth around it. Once the tree was planted, people began to disperse, many stopping to hug Layla or shake James's hand. As the crowd thinned, James and Layla found themselves alone by the newly planted tree. "How do you feel, Sweet Pea?" James asked, his arm around Layla's shoulders. Layla leaned into him, her eyes fixed on the small tree. "Happy," she said simply, "and a little sad, but mostly happy. Do you think the tree will grow as big as the old oak tree someday?" James smiled, looking from the sapling to the majestic old oak nearby. "With time and care, I'm sure it will. And every time we visit, we'll remember Mr. Thompson and the lesson he taught us." As they stood there, a group of children from Layla's class came running up, excited from their game of tag. "Layla," one of them called out, "come play with us." Layla looked up at her father questioningly. James nodded with a smile. "Go on, have fun. I'll be right here." As Layla ran off to join her friends, James watched her with a mixture of pride and wonder. In the few months since Mr. Thompson's passing, he had seen his daughter grow in ways he could never have imagined. She had always been kind, but now there was a depth to her compassion, a genuine understanding of the impact her actions could have on others. James's gaze drifted from Layla to the newly planted sapling, then to the old oak tree that had been Mr. Thompson's favorite spot. He thought about the cycles of life, how endings could lead to new beginnings, how a single act of kindness could set off a chain reaction of goodwill. As he watched Layla play, her laughter ringing out across the park, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. Grateful for Mr. Thompson's generosity, yes, but even more so for the lessons in kindness and compassion that had reshaped their lives. The financial gift had provided stability and opportunities, but the real treasure was the shift in perspective it had brought. James realized that in stepping back from the daily grind of work, he had stepped into a richer, more meaningful life. He was more present for Layla, more engaged with his community, more aware of the small moments of beauty and connection that he had often overlooked in the past. As the afternoon wore on, other families began to arrive at the park. James watched as Layla naturally gravitated toward the shy-looking boy who was standing alone near the swings. With a gentle smile and a few kind words, she soon had him laughing and playing with the group. It was a small moment, one that might have gone unnoticed just a few months ago. But now, James recognized it for what it was: another seed of kindness being planted, another life potentially changed by a simple act of compassion. Later, as the sun began to set and they prepared to head home, Layla ran back to the newly planted tree. She knelt beside it, her small hand gently touching one of its leaves. "Grow big and strong," she whispered. "We'll come back and visit you, I promise." As they walked hand in hand out of the park, Layla looked up at her father. "Daddy," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I think I want to be a teacher when I grow up, like Mr. Thompson was. I want to help kids learn and be kind to each other." James felt his heart swell with pride and love. "That's a wonderful goal, Sweet Pea. I think you'd make an amazing teacher. And maybe," Layla continued, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, "we can start a kindness club at school. We could do projects to help people and teach other kids about how important it is to be nice to everyone, even if they seem different or lonely." James nodded, once again amazed by his daughter's compassion and creativity. "That's an excellent idea, Layla. Why don't we talk to your principal about it next week?" As they reached their apartment building, they were greeted by Mrs. Gonzalez, who was watering the flowers in the small garden out front. "Ah, there's my favorite neighbors," she called out cheerfully. "How was the tree planting?" Layla rushed over to give Mrs. Gonzalez a hug. "It was beautiful, Mrs. Gonzalez. And guess what? We're going to start a kindness club at school." As Layla excitedly shared her plans with Mrs. Gonzalez, James stood back, watching the interaction with a warm smile. He thought about the ripple effect of kindness, how Mr. Thompson's final act of generosity had not only changed their lives, but was now spreading out into the community in ways they could never have predicted. That night, as James tucked Layla into bed, she asked a question that made him pause. "Daddy, do you think we'll ever forget Mr. Thompson?" James sat on the edge of her bed, considering his answer carefully. "No, sweetie, I don't think we will. Not as long as we keep living the lessons he taught us. Every time we're kind to someone, every time we help someone in need, we're remembering Mr. Thompson." Layla nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I'm glad," she murmured. "I want to keep making him proud." As James turned out the light and closed Layla's door, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and opportunities to make a difference. And while the path ahead might not always be easy, he knew that with Layla by his side, spreading kindness and compassion wherever she went, it would always be meaningful. He walked to the living room window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, he thought, there were people whose lives would be touched by Layla's kindness, just as theirs had been touched by Mr. Thompson's. It was a beautiful thought, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all people and the power of simple acts of compassion. As he turned away from the window, his gaze fell on a framed photo on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Layla and Mr. Thompson from that fateful night at Mama Rose's, both smiling widely at the camera. Next to it stood a small potted plant, a cutting from the oak sapling they had planted in the park, which Layla had insisted on nurturing at home as well. James touched the small leaves gently, marveling at how much life and growth could come from such a small beginning. It was a fitting metaphor, he thought, for the journey they had been on since meeting Mr. Thompson. As he prepared for bed, James felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns their life had taken. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a new way of living, a new understanding of what truly mattered in life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new chances to spread kindness and make a difference. But for now, in the quiet of the night, James was content in the knowledge that they were on the right path, a path illuminated by the enduring light of Mr. Thompson's final gift, not just of financial security, but of a lesson in the transformative power of compassion. The years seemed to fly by in a whirlwind of growth, change, and countless small acts of kindness. Layla, once a wide-eyed 8-year-old, was now a vibrant teenager on the cusp of high school. The sapling they had planted in Mr. Thompson's memory had grown into a sturdy young tree, its branches reaching skyward with each passing season. On a warm Saturday morning in late August, James found himself standing in Layla's doorway, watching as she carefully packed the last of her belongings into a suitcase. The walls of her room, once adorned with colorful drawings and posters of pop stars, now bore college pennants and framed certificates from various community service awards. "You sure you've got everything, Sweet Pea?" James asked, his voice catching slightly on the familiar nickname. Layla looked up, her smile a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. "I think so, Dad. But if I forgot anything, I'm sure we can send it later, right?" James nodded, stepping into the room to help her zip up the overstuffed suitcase. "Of course, though I'm not sure how you'll fit anything else into your dorm room at this rate." As they maneuvered the luggage out of the room, James's eyes fell on the small potted plant sitting on Layla's desk, a cutting from the oak tree they had planted for Mr. Thompson all those years ago. It had become a tradition for Layla to take a new cutting each year, nurturing it alongside her studies and her ever-growing commitment to community service. "Don't forget your tree," James reminded her gently. Layla's face softened as she picked up the pot. "I'd never forget this. It's coming with me to college, just like always." As they loaded the car, neighbors began to emerge from their apartments, drawn by the commotion and the knowledge that today was the day Layla would be leaving for college. Mrs. Gonzalez, now using a cane, but still as spirited as ever, hobbled over with a package in her hands. "Layla, mi amor," she called out, her eyes misty. "I made you some cookies for the trip, and some extra to share with your new friends at college." Layla embraced the older woman tightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Gonzalez." I'm gonna miss you so much." One by one, neighbors approached to wish Layla well. Mr. Ramirez, the superintendent, presented her with a small toolkit for any dorm room emergencies. Officer Chun, who had become a close family friend over the years, stopped by in her patrol car to give Layla a hug and remind her to stay safe on campus. As the impromptu farewell gathering grew, James found himself overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support for his daughter. He thought back to the day they had moved into this building, when they had barely known their neighbors. Now, it felt like they were surrounded by an extended family. Finally, with the car packed and the last goodbyes said, James and Layla set off for the 3-hour drive to her new college. As they pulled away from the curb, Layla twisted in her seat to wave at the group of well-wishers until they disappeared from view. The first hour of the trip passed in comfortable silence, both father and daughter lost in their thoughts. James stole glances at Layla, marveling at the poised young woman she had become. Her long curls were pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her eyes, still as expressive as ever, were fixed on the passing landscape. "Penny for your thoughts?" James finally asked, breaking the silence. Layla turned to him with a small smile. "I was just thinking about Mr. Thompson. Do you think he'd be proud of me, going off to college to study education and social work?" James felt a lump form in his throat. Even after all these years, Mr. Thompson's influence on their lives remained profound. "I know he would be, sweet pea. You've taken the lesson he taught us about kindness and turned it into a life's mission. I can't imagine anything that would make him prouder." Layla nodded, her eyes misting slightly. "I hope so. Sometimes I worry that I'm not doing enough, you know? There's still so much need in the world." James reached over to squeeze her hand. "Layla, the kindness club you started at your school has spread to dozens of other schools across the state. The weekend backpack program you helped expand now feeds hundreds of kids who might otherwise go hungry. And let's not forget all the seniors whose lives you've brightened through the Friendly Visitors program. You've done more good in your 18 years than most people do in a lifetime." "I guess," Layla said, a hint of her old shyness creeping into her voice. "But it never feels like enough. There's always more to do." James nodded, understanding all too well the weight of responsibility his daughter carried. "That's true. But remember what we always say. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change the world," Layla recited, a smile tugging at her lips. "Exactly," James affirmed. "You're going to college to learn how to make an even bigger impact. But never underestimate the power of the small acts of kindness you do every day." As they continued their journey, the conversation flowed more freely. Layla shared her hopes and fears about college life, while James offered what advice he could, all the while marveling at how quickly the years had passed. Finally, they arrived at the bustling college campus. Cars and minivans were parked everywhere, parents and students unloading boxes and suitcases. As James pulled into a parking spot, he saw Layla take a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Ready?" he asked gently. Layla nodded, her chin lifted with determination. "Ready." As they began unloading the car, James noticed a young woman struggling with a large box nearby. Before he could say anything, Layla had already spotted her and was moving to help. "Hey there," Layla called out cheerfully. "That looks heavy. Want a hand?" The girl looked up, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank you. That would be amazing." James watched as Layla easily lifted one end of the box, chatting animatedly with the girl as they made their way towards the dorm. In that moment, he saw not just his daughter, but the legacy of Mr. Thompson's kindness living on through her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions, orientation meetings, and dorm room setup. By late afternoon, Layla's room was as organized as it could be. Her new roommate had arrived, and it was time for James to say goodbye. Standing in the parking lot by his car, James found himself at a loss for words. How could he possibly express everything he was feeling? The pride, the love, the bittersweet ache of letting go. Layla, sensing his struggle, threw her arms around him in a fierce hug. "I'm going to miss you so much, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James hugged her back just as tightly. "I'll miss you too, sweet pea. But I am so so proud of you. You're going to do amazing things here." As they pulled apart, Layla wiped at her eyes. "I promise I'll call often, and I'll keep you updated on all my classes and projects." James nodded, fighting back his own tears. "I know you will. And don't forget, you can always come home if you need to. Your room will be waiting for you." With one final hug and a watery smile, Layla turned and walked back towards her dorm. James watched her go, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and melancholy. As she reached the entrance, Layla turned back to wave one last time before disappearing inside. The drive home felt impossibly long and quiet without Layla's presence. As James pulled into their familiar neighborhood, he was struck by how different everything felt. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but without Layla by his side, it all seemed somewhat dimmer. As he parked the car, he noticed a small group gathered near the entrance to their building. Mrs. Gonzalez, Mr. Ramirez, and several other neighbors were waiting, their faces expectant. "How did it go?" Mrs. Gonzalez asked as soon as James stepped out of the car. "Is our Layla all settled in?" James nodded, touched by their concern. "She's all moved in. Her roommate seems nice, and she's already made a few friends." The group listened intently as James recounted the day's events, their expressions a mixture of pride and wistfulness. It was clear that Layla's departure was felt not just by James, but by the entire community she had touched over the years. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, James found himself walking towards the park. His feet carried him automatically to the oak tree they had planted in Mr. Thompson's memory. It stood tall and strong now, its leaves rustling gently in the evening breeze. James sat on a nearby bench, his eyes fixed on the tree. "Well, Mr. Thompson," he said softly, "Layla's off to college. She's going to study education and social work, you know. Says she wants to make a career out of helping others and spreading kindness." He paused, feeling a little foolish for talking to a tree, but somehow comforted by the act. "I wish you could see her now. She's grown into such an amazing young woman. And it's all because of you, really. That one act of kindness you showed us. It changed everything." As James sat there, lost in thought, he barely noticed the figure approaching until Officer Chin sat down beside him. "Thought I might find you here," she said gently. "Rough day?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not rough, exactly. Just emotional. Layla's been the center of my world for so long. It's hard to imagine daily life without her around." Officer Chin nodded understandingly. "It's a big change for sure. But you know, James, you should be incredibly proud. Not just of Layla, but of yourself too. You've raised a remarkable young woman." "I had help," James said, gesturing towards the oak tree. "Mr. Thompson's legacy. It shaped both of us in ways I'm still discovering." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Finally, Officer Chin spoke again. "You know, James, I've been thinking. The programs Layla started, the friendly visitors, the weekend backpacks, the kindness clubs, they're going to need someone to keep them going now that she's away at college." James turned to her, eyebrows raised. "What are you suggesting?" Officer Chin smiled. "Well, you got all this free time now, and you've been right there beside Layla all these years, learning and growing just like she has. Why don't you take over? Keep Mr. Thompson's legacy alive right here in the community." James blinked, surprised by the suggestion, but immediately intrigued by the possibility. He thought about the fulfillment he'd found in recent years, working alongside Layla on her various projects. The idea of continuing that work, of keeping the spark of kindness burning brightly in their community, filled him with a sense of purpose. "You know what?" he said slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I'd like that. I think I'd like that a lot." As they stood to leave, James cast one last look at the oak tree. In the fading light, he could almost imagine Mr. Thompson standing there, nodding approvingly at this new chapter in their lives. Walking back to the apartment building, James felt a renewed sense of energy and purpose. Yes, Layla was embarking on her own journey now, but that didn't mean the work they'd started together had to end. In fact, this could be an opportunity to expand their efforts, to touch even more lives with the simple yet profound power of kindness. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, James's mind was already buzzing with ideas. He'd call the school tomorrow about continuing the kindness club. Maybe he could work with the local senior center to recruit more friendly visitors. And he'd need to touch base with the food bank about the weekend backpack program. Entering the quiet apartment, James was struck by Layla's absence. But instead of the melancholy he'd expected, he felt a quiet determination. His daughter was out in the world now, spreading kindness and making a difference on a larger stage. And here at home, he would continue the work they'd started together, nurturing the seeds of compassion that Mr. Thompson had planted all those years ago. As he got ready for bed, James's gaze fell on the framed photo of Layla and Mr. Thompson from that fateful night at Mama Rose's. He smiled, touching the frame gently. "Don't worry, Mr. Thompson," he said softly. "We're still here, still spreading kindness, still changing the world one small act at a time. And we always will be." With that, James turned out the light, ready to face the new chapter that awaited him in the morning. The house might be quieter now, but the legacy of kindness that had transformed their lives would continue to resound, touching countless lives in ways they might never fully know. What would you have done if you were in Layla's position and saw an old and lonely man celebrating his birthday all by himself? Would you have tried to reach out, or would you have been hesitant? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of time and effort into crafting these impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.